MBA schooled. And I'm excited today to talk with Naaman, who is from Management Consulted. And we're going to talk all about hiring and recruiting and management consulting. If you're not familiar with MBA Schooled, it's a guide to navigating business school. And we have a lot of great resources on there regarding management consulting. Just quick background, I am a retired management consultant. I grew up at Deloitte in the firm, spent about 5 years there. Did 2 stints, went to UNC Kenan-Flagler in between, so shout out to all the Tar Heels that are on the call. But this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and I know Naaman breathes this every day at Management Consulted, and so we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on, and also to get a sense of what questions you have so we can try to answer them as well. So really quickly, I gave you a little bit of background on me, but I want to give Naaman a little bit of chance for him to introduce himself and talk a little bit about Management Consulted. So Naaman, do you want to do an introduction? Just tell us who you are and what you're up to.
Absolutely. Hey, everybody. Thanks for hanging out with us on a Saturday afternoon, Saturday evening. Y'all are the true believers. If you're going to show up on a Saturday to talk about consulting, you're our kind of people. So we're excited to be here today. Like Al mentioned, my name is Naaman, COO at Management Consulted. And you know, we are the world's largest resource for consulting news and consulting prep. We've got 4 million readers and listeners per year. I see some familiar names and faces on here, so it's good to see you all. And you know, we are at the forefront of really lifting the veil on the consulting industry, right? As I'm sure most of you have realized, the industry is quite opaque in its kind of hiring processes and recruiting processes and what life is like inside the firm and what you can expect. And so we exist really to lift the veil for you and then help you get prepared for consulting, recruiting, and interviews. And so really excited to speak to those kind of twin realities today, right? The industry landscape and also what you can do personally to prepare and put yourself in the best position to succeed.
That's great. Thanks for the introduction. All right, so we're going to start off with some warm-up questions, and we're going to need your participation to do this. So I'm going to ask a question, and then I want to have you put your answer in the chat just to get a sense of where people are right now. So to start, if you wouldn't mind just answering, just put it in the chat. Where are you in your management consulting recruiting journey right now? What are you focused on, or what stage are you at? Are you knee deep in it, or are you still thinking about it? Are you focused on cases? Are you a second year kind of evaluating what's okay? So Josh knows the deal. All right. Practicing cases over and over. All right. Emily's exploring and recruiting for an internship. Jenny's focused on a summer internship. Practicing for cases for a shot at MBB. We got some second years who's recruiting for full time. That's great. First roundtable was yesterday, case prep. Rising second year. Okay. About to start corporate presentations and beginning case prep. All right. And it's about the middle-ish of September, just for context. So that's great. Haven't started casing yet, but started networking. Awesome. Okay, great. So I'm going to go to the next question. Feel free to keep putting your responses in though. But the next question is, what's your biggest challenge right now? What's keeping you up at night, or what are you pondering and thinking about? Would love to have you put that in the chat. Okay, networking and casing. Yep. Part-time student, thinking about the timeline. Sure. Casing, networking, finding meaningful connections virtually. Yes, that's a challenging one for sure. Feel you, Joseph. Casing, what's prioritized? Always a good one, Matthew. Gatekeepers, yes, another good one. Yeah, that's a good, thank you, LA. Actually getting a real sense of the firms during virtual recruiting, landing those interviews. Jonathan, am I behind? Yes. That's a good one. Applicable to lots of areas of life, but in particular, management consulting, yes. Opaque as to which U.S. consulting from sponsor internationals. Yep, totally understand that one. Plus 1,000, okay. Adolfo is with you by a lot. Definitely understand and appreciate that. All right, thanks everyone. Last one. Where are you spending the most amount of time? With where you are right now, what are you spending the most amount of time and what you're focused on and what you're doing? Okay, networking, firm research, great. Casey, with the firm research, would you mind just putting in the chat, what you're using or where you're going or what resources you have, just so other people can maybe learn? if they're not sure. LA Marts, LinkedIn, research of alums at firms, case prep for B School casebooks, GPA and foundation and casing. Yep. Mix of virtual networking and from LinkedIn and using the alumni network. Perfect. Thanks, Casey. Those are all great resources. All great resources. Awesome. These are great answers and give us some good context. Okay, great. Well, thank you for those. And what I would also say is that we're going to start kind of the Q&A portion, and I'm going to turn it over to Naaman in a little bit. But if you have questions that come up, feel free to put them in the chat. If you have comments, feel free to put them in the chat. We're watching it, we're monitoring it, and when we can, if we know of a resource, we'll throw it in there so you can respond. So certainly pay attention to us, but definitely use the chat to your advantage, because that is why it's there. Okay, Naaman, I want to go to the Q&A portion now, and I want to just maybe start with just, you are a pretty busy guy, and you work a lot with students who are interested, but you also spend your time with some employers as well and some other folks within the industry.
Yeah,
so maybe just kind of to start, middle of September, kicking off recruiting for first years, but also we just finished the summer cycle for second years. Give us a sense of where things are at right now. Also, obviously understanding COVID's a real thing, and it's impacting all of us, and it's evolving. So start us off with just some context of where we are right now.
Yeah, so we're in the thick of full-time recruiting right now for second-year MBAs, and firms are just now also starting to think about how they're going to, the internship targets they're going to set for first years, and the plans that they're making with career centers to be on campus virtually, and how they're going to market themselves and present themselves to all of you first years. But as far as the lay of the land goes, here's where we're at. Most firms had their biggest intern classes ever this last summer, and that was something that was set in stone pre-COVID. And so regardless of if COVID was going to happen or not, we were going to see some kind of restriction on kind of full-time spots available this fall, because the expectation was that at that same kind of 80 to 90% offer level that firms give their intern classes, that was going to be now extended to a bigger pool. And so there was already going to be restricted spots. Now what's happened is many firms have, out of that largest intern pool ever, they've extended return offers to everybody. So 100% of folks have been extended offers, and more of those folks are going to take them because of a lack of opportunity elsewhere. So what's happening is, across most firms, there is a restriction in the number of full-time spots that are available, even if the firms are saying otherwise. But that doesn't mean that all hope is lost, because at the same time, most firms are taking a through-cycle approach. They understand that they need to continue to fill the pipeline of talent, and they are going to continue to recruit. What it means is that you just need to set yourself apart that much more, because the competition, unfortunately, is just tougher this year than it was even just last year.
Yeah, thank you for that context. And I think that, so another thing to kind of bring to light here is that with respect to, let's take second years for an example. So if you read the news or things like the Wall Street Journal, you may have seen an article about how there was an article a couple of weeks ago about kind of hiring in general for MBAs. And they pointed to kind of the downturn of this because hiring second years for full-time roles in consulting was going to be less than it was before. And so there was a whole big hullabaloo, and there is a lot of noise about that. I'm looking for the article right now that I can share, and here it is for those of you who just subscribe to the Wall Street Journal. And there's that. And I think it's important to note, and Naaman, if you can share some context from what you've seen too, is that consulting firms really do want to convert their summer associates. There's a lot of business reasons for that. Number one, it costs them less to hire if they don't have to. So if they can get a conversion, that's great. And in many years, it is a successful summer and a successful recruiting season for Ernst & Young or PwC when they don't have to go back to campus in the fall, because that means they were able to convert their summers. And so, I just wanted to point that out for context for folks to know that, yes, if there are some firms who may not be recruiting this fall, but part of that is also by design in many cases because of the fact that they did really well in their conversion, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the right strategic move for them. And even though that's tough to say, knowing who's on the call, right? That's what they should be doing. The good news is that there are still opportunities. And so, I want to be realistic here, but I also want to be a broker of hope, right? To let folks know that there are still opportunities out there. But you're
Yeah.
absolutely right. Like that is the way that firms approach recruiting. Right, they are absolutely prioritizing their internship pipeline, and that's good news for the first years on the call because they're going to continue to do that. One notable exception to what we were talking about as far as firms restricting full-time hiring this fall, McKinsey made very clear this summer that they were going to continue their hiring at the same level as last year at both the intern and full-time levels. And last year, McKinsey hired about 1,000 MBAs from across the country. And so they were very clear and very direct this summer that they were going to continue that trend. And I have not seen or heard anything different in the last 4 to 6 weeks that would indicate anything otherwise.
Sure. And jumping back a little bit, I know you might have covered it a little bit, but maybe we can dive a little deeper. Akshay has a question of what was the reason that firms hired their largest intern class this past year?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's what we were talking about, Al, right? Like this is the strategic imperative when it comes to recruiting, right? It's cheaper for firms to have a larger class of interns than it is to take a risk on more full-time folks the next year. Number one. Number two, you have more evangelists for your firm when folks go back to campus, right? To enhance that brand prestige, to let other folks know who didn't recruit for consulting last year. You know what? My summer at PwC was fantastic. I know you were at Citibank, but you really need to consider PwC. You need to re-recruit, right? Right. They only get one chance to have those evangelists on campus. And so the bigger intern class you have, the more evangelists you have. And also just market dynamics, right? Consulting in a bearable market, consulting has grown for the last 12 years consecutively, right? In most of the last decade, we've seen double-digit annual growth in consulting services. So firms are understanding that they are primarily and only human capital-driven businesses, right? The asset that consulting firms sell is you, the consultant. And so as they continue to sell more work, as they continue to grow, they just need more human capital. And so they need to expand the top of the funnel.
I absolutely agree with that. And for context, I joined Deloitte as an analyst in 2010. And it honestly was a stroke of luck in many respects, because by that point, for you history buffs out there, things had finally started to get back to a decent pace after the 2007, 2008 recession. So when I joined, I think I got staffed within a week. And for the 3 years that I was there, I barely had any bench time. But the part of the reason why was because things had just come back and companies needed help. And in some cases, they were coming to consulting firms like Deloitte because they weren't necessarily ready to ramp back up their full-time hiring, right? And so the takeaway there is that consulting very much is pegged to what is going on in the broader business landscape and dynamics. And for a lot of different reasons, not an economist, but for a lot of different reasons, companies have really had to rely on consulting firms over the past 8 to 10 years for various different reasons. And I think you can make the argument that even now in COVID, even though there are some companies out there who are certainly tightening their purse strings, there is absolutely a need and demand for consulting services in certain areas because companies have had to do things that they may not have had to do before. If you're a company that has customer service agents that typically go to a call center every day, but now all of a sudden they have to work from home. Well, how do you do that, right? Like you need help. So I think the important takeaway though is that for those of you out there who are interested in consulting, in addition to all the many things that you have to do to prepare for the consulting, I really encourage you to really take some time to understand the business model and the dynamics of how consulting firms work. As Naaman said, it is a human capital business. And I think if you understand that a little bit better, it's going to also help you understand a little bit some of the reason why there are some firms that are hiring more and some that are hiring less, or why firms choose to make the decisions that they make. And because I think it is a critical, important thing that sometimes gets glossed over in the pursuit of really trying to land that offer.
Absolutely. And for those of you that go to consulting, just as a quick add-on, right? I would say if you go to Bain or EY or PwC or Strategy, and I would encourage you, pay attention to how PwC runs PwC. You'll probably learn more from that than you will from any other thing that you observe or take part in while you're in consulting, right? Pay attention to how these companies run themselves. There's a lot of insights there to be gained.
I couldn't agree more. During my time at Deloitte, I worked on a number of what we called internal projects, where that was literally what I got a bird's eye view into, where I literally got a firsthand look at how they run the business. and it gave me a much better understanding of what I was doing when I actually showed up on a project on day one, or like why the firm would make certain decisions. And while they're all human capital businesses, there are nuances and differences between them, right? In terms of, and I'm sure you probably see this because when you send people to different places, Deloitte is and EY and PwC, they are public accounting firms that have consulting businesses, but they are partnerships, right? Accenture is a publicly traded company. McKinsey, Bain, BCG, private partnerships. Those have implications to them in terms of the decisions that they make, as well as even scale, but also just in terms of how they operate in career progression and all those things. And I think all those things are really important to think about and consider when you are just, kind of deciding on opportunities that are out there.
Absolutely. And I think that's actually a perfect segue to Casey's question, if you don't mind me jumping in, Al.
Sure, go for it.
We just had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with the head North American recruiter for KPMG, and he was talking about how KPMG's fiscal year ends September 30th, and they are a partnership. And so they are delaying hiring until October 1st as to not affect partner bonuses that end this fiscal year, right? And so just a perfect example of how KPMG runs its business affects hiring and recruiting and headcount and all of that.
Sure. That's a really good point, because Deloitte's fiscal year ends, I believe, in May. And so they have the luxury, I think it's a luxury. I have to think about this a little bit more, but I think it's a luxury to have a pulse of how their year ends before they make decisions about how they choose to recruit on campus in the fall.
Yeah.
I think in some ways that helps, or at least they have that hindsight and that insight to work off of as they think about heading back to campus. But again, to your point, even a simple thing as like the fiscal year can, certainly have impacts in terms of how companies choose to recruit or choose not to. And that's there's the link in there to the conversation with the KPMG's director of campus recruiting. That's really awesome. I'm going to throw another link in there. If you have Business Insider Prime, there's an article that they did where they really took a look at understanding what consulting recruiting was going to look like at some of these firms in the fall. So definitely worth checking out for sure. And I want to go back to something else, and Naaman, let's talk a little bit about what changes and what stays the same, right? Because yes, there's definitely some changes. Most notably, companies probably will not be showing up to campus. But while there are changes and things are going to be different, there's probably still some things that are still going to be the same. So what's the same? Like, what do people here need to really focus on?
Yeah.
Like, that isn't any different than any other year.
Great question. And the short answer is most of it is the same, right? Which is good news because, if you've been following us for some time, right, our guidance still holds true. So here's what you should be focusing on. And I know a lot of people mentioned it in the chat at the beginning, right? Networking is key, right? So you should be focused on networking, right? The firm wants to speak to you before they ever interview you, right? They really treat networking as around zero. And so the value for that hasn't changed even in a virtual environment, right? A lot of the timelines, I know that there are probably going to be some questions about timeline. For most firms, timelines have not changed. I think Deloitte has pushed internship timelines back a little bit, but they are right now the exception and not the rule as far as consulting goes. So you can expect the same kind of timeline. And for the most up-to-date guidance, I'd go to your career center to get that, because it's going to be a little bit different depending on which program you're in. But for the most part, timelines have not changed, right? The interview process hasn't changed, right? Everyone is preparing and perhaps scared of the case, and rightfully so. But, at these firms, fit is 50% of your interview score. That has not changed, right? So what has changed is that the interviews will be taking place virtually, right? And so across the board, we can expect, right, virtual case interviews. What does that mean, right? It really, all that means is that you have to be over-structured and over-communicative, because you don't have the ability then to turn your paper around and slide it to the other side of the table and show the interviewer your thought process and show the interviewer your math steps, right? And what firms are not really stoked about is you holding your paper up to the camera and showing them. And most firms so far that we've seen are not really utilizing kind of Zoom whiteboards or anything else in the virtual interview process. So you have to be really, really structured in the way that you communicate inside the case. You have to speak in numbers even more than you did before. And you have to make sure, right, that someone can follow your thought process without seeing a piece of paper, right? So that really is what's changed. The good news is, right, that's really the only thing that's changed, right? Everything else, as far as expectations go, as far as what the firms are looking for from you, is really consistent.
Thanks for clarifying that. I'm wondering, as you think about this need to, because I know casing has come up quite a bit, as you think about this need to do this virtually, as you and management consultant do your workshops and prepare students for these virtual cases, are there any things that you recommend people do to kind of get more comfortable for doing it in a virtual environment? And I know it's not necessarily entirely new, because in the past, there certainly were times when a firm couldn't make it to campus and they wanted to do it, virtually. But for some of us, it's going to be more at scale, and there's going to be more of it. And so, any types of thoughts or guidance to folks here in terms of a tip or two for getting more comfortable with that notion of having to do it in a virtual way?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to structure my answer actually into two parts.
Nice.
So one, let's talk about the case itself, right? So case prep itself, you have to practice out loud, right? And there's a place for reading books. We've written 5 of them ourselves, right? There's a place for watching videos. We've got like a really robust YouTube library of hundreds of videos. Like, go take advantage. It's all free, right? There's a place for that. But what really sets you apart in the prep process is the sooner that you can begin to practice out loud. The case interview is a verbal test just as much as it is a mental one. And so if you wait until the last minute to start practicing out loud, you are behind the 8 ball. Someone asked, like, am I behind? Right? And you're behind if you don't start practicing out loud. And so, and that really holds true whether it's an in-person interview or virtual, right? So really begin to practice structuring your communication, your answers, in a way where someone can follow them if they have no other reference point, right? That's a great way to begin. And really, how do you do that, right? You've got a community at MBA Schooled. We've got a community at Management Consulted. You've got your peers inside of your programs, right? Do this kind of peer prep via Zoom and actually practice in a virtual environment, and practice actually looking at the camera and not looking down, right? Practice being in a carpeted room with no kind of distracting background, right? Make sure, I'm not following my own advice here, but make sure you have headphones that have a mic, right? Like, make sure that all of the other distractions that would potentially pop up in a virtual environment are taken care of. So then you can really focus on the task at hand, which is solving a business problem for a client.
I think that's great advice. So something that I think about when it comes to this kind of stuff, it's applicable to both casing prep, but also anything, is Cal Newport, the author, has this concept of deliberate practice. And so many of you may have seen this concept of Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours, right? If you can do something for 10,000 hours, you can become an expert. And while there certainly is a certain amount of quantity of time that can help you become better at something, one of the really important things to help you become better at something is being purposeful about the practice that you put in. And so what you just mentioned in terms of setting it up the right way in your room, putting it under game-like conditions, right? It's like, if I'm LeBron James, like, I'm not gonna play a bunch of JV players. Like, I want to play against the best players when I can in my practice, so that when I go up against some of the best players in the NBA, like, I am ready and I can handle that. And so for those of you out there, when you're practicing, it's not about necessarily the hours, right? The person who cases and practices the most isn't always going to be the person who's going to be the best at it. In fact, I'd argue a lot of times, I mean, you can chime in from your experience here, but I argue it probably isn't. But it really does need to be deliberate and focused and under those right conditions.
Absolutely. And, that's actually one of the reasons that McKinsey instituted the PEI, the personal experience interview, which is a really, really robust fit interview, really based off a legal interrogation. And why did they institute that kind of fit interview? They realized years ago that their best case performers often were their worst consultants. And so they needed a better way to evaluate candidates, right? And so it's not just about, now to your point, Al, right? It's not just about, just as the hours of prep you put in don't necessarily equate to case success. Case success doesn't necessarily equate to consulting success either.
Sure.
Right. And so here's how we recommend you prepare at Management Consultant. I'll give you the real high level, right? You practice out loud, you get feedback from people who know what they're talking about, whether it's us, whether it's peers, whether it's career coaches, right? And you do drill-based practice on areas of weakness, right? So if you identify after about 5 to 10 live cases, you know what? Structure is an issue for me. I struggle staying messy, or I keep it really high level and I don't have, right? There's not enough branches on my issue tree. There's not enough kind of categories in my buckets. whatever approach you take, right? It's not robust enough. Then how do I prepare? It's not by doing 100 cases. It's by doing an hour of just case starts over and over again. And let me do 10 to 15 to 20 structures in that hour, right? And let me then present them out loud. And then once I do them out loud, let me go back and do it again, right? And that's how you accelerate your progress. That's how you cut down on the amount of time that you need to prepare. It really is about quality over quantity. And the way that you get there is by doing drill-based practice.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's really valuable insight for the folks who are just getting started with casing. And on that notion of just quantity doesn't always trump quality, let's talk a little bit about networking, right? Just as just doing the most amount of cases doesn't always equate to success. Simply collecting the most LinkedIn requests or virtual business cards with McKinsey or Bain isn't always going to equate to success as well. And so thinking particularly in the context of all of this being virtual, what can you say or share about what students should be thinking about when it comes to networking, but also learning about these firms, right? And I know there was a concern earlier about how am I going to learn about them if I'm not going to be able to meet them in person? And so anything you can kind of share on those topics, because I know it's important, and I know that it's going to be a little different this year.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me start with the learning about them. We'll get to the networking. So the firms are doing more and more kind of campus agnostic webinars as well. And you can go to their kind of career pages and find those, join them, right? Interact with folks in the chat there, right? Listen to, what they have to say, right? So join those on top of whatever's happening on campus. That's a great way to learn about the firm. But the best way to learn about the firm is actually by networking, right? There's two reasons you network. It's not just to get your foot in the door, it's to do research, right? Because if you're a top performer, you have options. And so what you're conveying as you're networking, right, and asking them questions about the office, the practice, the firm, is that, hey, I'm a top performer and I'm evaluating you just as much as you're evaluating me. And so the way that I recommend our clients and just folks in general go about networking is use LinkedIn to do research, but don't reach out on LinkedIn, right? It's social media, and I am inundated by messages and requests on LinkedIn. And that's not the best place to get a hold of me, and it's not the best place to get a hold of a consultant, right? Why do consultants go to LinkedIn? To think about their next job, right? I'm not in the frame of mind. I'm not thinking about my current role and responsibility if I'm on LinkedIn, most likely, right? And if you are successful reaching out to somebody on LinkedIn and having a conversation with them, you're gonna have to move that conversation over to email anyways at some point if you're gonna get on their calendar and have a call, right? And so you might as well start by sending an email. And so I do research on LinkedIn, right? I do this still to this day when I wanna reach out to folks cold, right? I figure out who they are, but then I go find out their company's email moniker. And we've got a tool at Management Consultant. It's called our Consulting Firm Directory. We've got 200 kind of profiles of consulting firms in there. And we've done the research and we've identified what their email moniker is. So if there's a Jane Smith at Bain that you find on LinkedIn, you automatically have Jane's email because you can go to our firm directory and you can plug her name into the email formula and write her an email. And what you're going to do is you want to write her an email and you want to jump on the phone with these people, right? Like one 15-minute call where you're going to really clearly, share with them who you are, you're going to get input from them on who they are, and you're going to ask them a couple specific questions about their experience at the firm, right? And we have a whole networking training on this, and this is, 100 miles an hour, really high level, right? But, at the end of that call is when you're going to make an ask for a referral or some kind of next step, right? Like, especially at the MBA level, right? They really want this to be a transactional process right now. They'll build a relationship with you after you join the firm, right? I'm not really super interested in having a million conversations with you on the front end. I'm interested in making the best use of my time and talking to as many people as possible. So let me just kind of wrap this up here, right? The best way for you to network and to learn about the firm is to reach out to folks directly via email and have a conversation with them over the phone, right? After that, the best way for you to capitalize on that is say, I really enjoyed learning about Bain and about the New York office specifically, right? You really clarified the questions that I had, and you've confirmed for me that, Bain is a place that I want to be, right? Would you feel comfortable referring me for the consultant role, right? If they say yes, right, going back to this quality versus quantity conversation, your work is done, right? Like 5 referrals isn't necessarily better than 2, right? So if you've got a referral, right, great, thanks so much, right? How should I follow up with you? And if they say no, say, hey, like really appreciate your candor, right? What can I do between now and the time applications drop to improve my profile? And you'll get some feedback straight from the horse's mouth. Either way is a win for you, right? And so networking is key, not just to get into the interview rounds, but really for you to figure out which firms and offices and practice areas are the right fit for you.
Yep, this is great. And so there's a bunch of questions coming in. So this is awesome. So let me take the first one because I'm pretty sure it's easy. So Lindsay asked, do they have some sort of benefit if I'm hired? This is generally true in most places. They do not typically do referral bonuses for campus hires. And even as someone who works at a non-consulting company, that's true at my company as well, which is sad because I have only gotten referrals into my company from campus hires, and none of my non-campus hires have ever gone in. So that's sad, but it is what it is. So Lindsay, no, they don't, other than just knowing that they feel really good about hopefully that they were able to get you in the door. But what I would say, Lindsay, is that there is very much so, particularly if you're at a school that has a company that recruits on campus, company recruiting teams, particularly those students who have worked at the company or interned there previously, they're more or less corporate espionage teams. So those second years are gonna get asked by the McKinsey recruiter, hey, who's good in the first year class? Like, did you like this person? Would they be a good fit here? Would they have the capabilities to succeed here? I know this because I was on the corporate espionage team when I was at Deloitte. If you know any students who are from Deloitte who are in your class who are sponsored by GSAP, the Graduate School Assistance Program, many of them are on the recruiting team. Many of them are going to give feedback to the recruiting manager as well as the campus recruiting team. And that's not there to scare you. That's there because, number one, you can go to them to talk to them, and because they can tell you about their experience. But number two, to Naaman's point, you don't need to belabor it and have to meet with everyone, but know that you do want to put a good foot forward when you do have that conversation by asking thoughtful questions, by demonstrating your interest, by not wasting their time, because their opinions do matter. And I have definitely been able to sway decisions, being in my experience and being on a campus recruiting team. And I know I'm not the only one. So it's just food for thought. Some of you second years probably know this if you're on the call, but keep that in mind again, as you're going through the recruiting process again. That's going to be really mindful and helpful. Akshay has a bunch of questions. So Naaman, I'm going to let you take some of these. And these are all good because these tend to come up a lot. So should we network with people in the same office location where we want to work or any office? And then at what levels? And I think let's start with those two, because I think those are two common questions that I know I get too.
Yeah, absolutely. So network inside of the offices you're targeting, right? And there's some leeway here if you're at a core school,
yes,
right? Because then all of the kind of recruiting gets funneled through that on-campus recruiting team. So, right, it's a little bit less important if you're a core school, especially if you're like a national core school, right? Where, folks from your program are placed all over the country and you're not just a regional. But it's always best practice, right, to network inside of your target offices. Because especially if you're coming from a non-target environment, your application gets routed through your first choice office, right? And so if you are kind of agnostic about where you want to live and work, right, my advice to you is, right, make your first choice office the place where you have the strongest advocate. That's going to really maximize your chances of getting in the door. And then which level should you be networking with? If they are alums, as high as you can possibly go, right? So if there are alums, right, feel free to reach out to a partner or a manager. Just recognize that partners don't necessarily want to be involved in the recruiting process at this stage, right? Their job inside the firm is to sell work, right? And that's taken on an outsized importance now, right, in this kind of COVID reality that we're in. Managers are the busiest people inside of firms, right? They're managing the client, they're managing the partner, and they're managing the teams of consultants. So they also don't necessarily want to be involved in recruiting at this stage, right? But if they're alums, it's fair game to reach out to those folks. Where you really want to reach out is post-MBA consultants that are just 1 to 2 years ahead of you, right? So they're kind of before that first promotion cycle post-MBA. Those are the folks that are going to be reviewing your applications. They're the ones who have the greatest input at this point of the recruiting process. They're the ones who decide who gets interviewed, right? Managers and partners evaluate you in the interview, but they don't necessarily make a call on who gets interviewed.
I think that's great advice. And what I would kind of do to add color to that is that you want to. I think it's good to get a diversity of voices in there. And here's how I would think about it. You want to talk to the second years first and foremost, because hopefully they can tell you what their experience was like this summer. So that's real world, real context. This is what your summer could be like. You want to hit the first and second years out, or for 1 to 2 years out, because they're at the firm, they're living and breathing it, and because they're going to do that first kind of round of vetting, and they're probably going to be some of the most active and engaged people.
Yeah.
You may want to hit someone who's maybe 3 to 5 years out, who has been able to secure that first promotion, so that you can understand what it takes to be successful in the firm that you were potentially targeting. And then I think you also at some point may want to hit someone who's maybe at Deloitte, it would be the senior manager level, or the managing director level at a PwC, or senior manager at Bain. Someone who's kind of a little bit further along, who has thought a little bit more about what a longer term career could be like here. And then certainly obviously the partner level as well. And I think you don't have to, I mean, you can choose how many you want to do, but I think from just a learning perspective of the type of insights that you could get, I think that's a good way to think about it. So you can have it covered from like, what is my day-to-day going to be like this summer, all the way to, if I were to do this for a while, what would that look like? Or what could that look like?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's good advice. And, if you're going to 80-20 it, which I'm that kind of guy, right? Then I would really prioritize the second years and then that first kind of tier out of B school, right? Because they're the ones who are going to have the most outsized influence on your application. But then the rest of the conversations are going to be, you're probably going to get some richer insights there. And so it really just depends on the goal that you have going into the conversation.
Sure. And the other thing I would say too, because I think it came up in the question just about, what do we like, what do you want to find out in these conversations, right? Like, I mean, yes, like you want to make a good impression, like, yes, you want to show your interest, but what are the types of questions you should be asking, or at least conceptually, like what should you be trying to find out?
That's the right question, right? That's a great question. So our guidance is you want to keep your questions PSP, positive, specific, and personal, right? And what you're really trying to figure out is, would I be a good fit here, right? And so, you know what, Al, like, I imagine that you had your pick of offices on the West Coast, right? Why did you pick Deloitte San Francisco, right? And you'll give me insight into the San Francisco office that maybe, an on-campus recruiter can't, right? Al, what's the most interesting project that you've worked on in the last 6 months, and why, right? I'm not asking you questions where I could just go to Deloitte's website or managementconsulting.com and find the answer, right? I'm asking you questions about your personal experience, where if I know how to read between the lines, I can see, okay, right? Like, you might tell me, you know what, Naaman, I've been staffed on the last project for 12 months. So there's only one answer to that. And I might say, okay, I don't like that, right? I want shorter, more frequent turnover, right? Maybe this isn't the right office, practice area, or firm for me, right? So I'm reading in between the lines to figure out, okay, right, is this the office? Is this the type of work I want to do? Is this the type of person that I'd want to be in a foxhole with 12 hours a day? And so, right, PSP questions are what we recommend. People love talking about themselves, number one. And number two, that's where you get the best insights.
I think that's really great advice. And as someone who has done plenty of informational interviews for management consulting, I'm going to give you a couple of things that I wish people asked me that I think if they asked would be really helpful. Number one is around, what does career development and performance management look like at your firm? Because companies do it differently. And I think that's important, because if you have any desire to move up or to kind of get promoted, which many of you will, I think it's important for you to kind of know that. And there are implications for that. And very, very tactically, at Deloitte, there's this thing called firm activities that mean a big deal. It's in addition to the client work that you do. And oftentimes can be a thing that helps propel someone forward versus keeps them in place. Other firms don't value that at all, right? And so that has a very different career trajectory, career progression, if you were to go to Deloitte versus if you were to go to somewhere else. I think the other thing that I would ask, and I wish people asked more about was, what does a good day look like for you, and what does a challenging day look like for you? I think that we're all adults, and we all know that not every moment's going to be rainbows and butterflies. And consulting in many ways is a very sexy job, but there's a lot of challenging aspects of it. And I think, I mean, there's a way to ask someone what about your job is shitty by not asking what about your job is shitty, but being able to do it in a thoughtful way. I appreciate when people ask that, because it shows me that they're being intentional and really trying to understand what this thing is, for all the great parts of it and for all the challenging parts of it. And so, and then the other thing I would say is that if you can find questions that follow PSP, but that you can ask from firm to firm, I think that can be helpful to you in understanding, oh, okay, this is how it might look like at Deloitte versus this is how it might look like at KPMG, right? Or this is, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's sometimes what helps you kind of gain greater insights into each of the firms. Because the reality of it is that many of you are going to probably be interviewing at a lot of these places, or you're going to want to. And, if you do get into the first world problem of getting multiple offers, like those are going to be the things that help you really decide, oh, okay, now I understand why this is a good fit versus why, versus another firm or something else.
Absolutely. And I know that we're kind of limited in time today, but if I could just kind of say two more things about networking, and then we can,
sure,
move on. The first would be really, right, don't ask the kind of questions, right, to Al's point, right, do you think AI is going to replace consultants in the next 30 years, right? Like, is our industry going to become obsolete? Like, no one wants to have that kind of conversation with you. Like, no one wants to think about their own demise. So you might think you're being insightful or showcasing your business acumen, but really you're just making a bad impression. So, right, just stay away from those kinds of negative questions, right, in that way, right? You can ask about the challenging parts of someone's day, right, like Al said, but those kind of like big, like industry-wide, like, is consulting going to be disrupted, right? Like, this is not the time for that, right? Like, you have to be really, really clear as far as what your intentions are and what you're trying to get out of the call, right? And the reputation you're building for yourself. And and then the second thing that I'll just say is, the way that you communicate is just as important as what you say. Sure. So we're not going to get into the tactics of this today, but make sure that you set an agenda, make sure that you stick to the time limit that you promised someone you'd stick to, right? Right. The way that you communicate, the executive presence, the gravitas that you have on a call is just as important, right? When someone is, interviewing for a job at management consultant, I know within the first 2 minutes if I want to move them on in the process or not, right? I give them the 15 minutes out of courtesy and because we scheduled 15 minutes, but like, I know in the first 2 minutes if I want them speaking to our clients or if I want to introduce them to someone else on our team. And so just be really aware of that as well.
Naaman, LA is a fan of your quote. No one wants to think about their own demise.
Feel free to put that on a meme or something somewhere. Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's shift topics for a second. Let's go back to hiring and recruiting again. And I want to let's talk a little bit about. We're not economists. We don't know we're not public health officials either. So, but like, let's try to look into the future a little bit. And this question is more geared towards the second years who are on this call. Do you have a sense of, so we know at least for the big companies, like what it's like out there right now, but are there any firms out there, whether it's vertical, whether it's capability or industry, that maybe are hiring or could be hiring because they might be seeing an increased demand? Do you have any insights around that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I already mentioned them, but McKinsey is one. Okay. And McKinsey was actually engaged by the state of New York and I believe the federal government as well this past spring and summer to help with COVID response. So consultants were 100% utilized throughout the spring and summer at McKinsey, and that really has kind of helped them, right, navigate COVID in a different way than some other firms that may not have had those public sector contracts. So McKinsey is one where there's opportunity. Some other verticals, healthcare is hot right now. Bankruptcy and turnaround, right, will be hot, right, unfortunately. But firms like Alvarez and Marsal, Alex Partners, FTI Consulting are great places to look. They're incredible brand names inside the space. They do really interesting work, and their pay is really comparable to MBB as well. So you're not really missing out a whole lot, except for maybe some of the brand equity that the name on the resume gets you down the road. I mean, those are fantastic places to land post MBA. And so, right, healthcare, that bankruptcy and turnaround, and also, just consulting is still going to be in demand, right? Like, a lot of companies right now, they have cash flow and liquidity problems. Who helps you with that? Consulting firms, right? Right, in this new virtual environment, we're asking questions about digital adoption. We're asking questions about different ways to do sales and marketing. We're asking questions, different supply chain and procurement questions. We're asking different operational questions. Like as a CEO or as a COO or as a company, where do I go to get those questions answered? I go to consulting firms, right? And so like even outside of those verticals, there is a demand for consulting services. But specifically, if you're looking for kind of hot industries to target, healthcare, bankruptcy, turnaround would be some of the first places I'd look.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm glad you brought like some of those firms like Alex Partners and Alvarez and Marsal up because I do agree with you. I think they're going to be in really high demand. And in some ways, I think they also benefit from the not necessarily having the economies of scale that some of the bigger shops have, right? In terms of just being able to operate a little bit more efficiently and more nimbly during these times. And so I think that's a great opportunity. So if you're a second year out there looking for some firms to get to know a little bit better, I think those are some great ones to think about. I think the other thing, to your point, 100% agree with you in terms of looking at the fact that companies need help, like they do. The companies need help, and when they need help, they go to consultants, right? Some of the things they went to consultants for help for in the past, maybe not so much anymore, right? For certain areas, but in other areas they do need help in other ways, and certainly a lot of times one of the benefits of hiring a firm to help you with these things is that you don't have to bring them on full time like you would if you were trying to hire. And so there is some nuance there in terms of, yes, things are challenging right now for lots of reasons. Cash is tight, but there are some opportunities for consultants to be able to be successful in this environment just because of the nature of how this works. And I think the other thing I would bring up too is that if you're trying to think about where to go or like what industries to target, even I think that a lot of times hiring very much gives a lens into the strategic areas of the business. Like as an example, if you go and look out at a company's website right now and you look at where they're hiring, to Naaman's point, if they're, let's say, a software company, if you see a lot of positions in the healthcare vertical and the public sector vertical, well, there's a reason why, right? And that's because very much like McKinsey, they're probably getting engaged to use their software like in those industries because those industries are really important right now. Or if you look at other businesses and if you look at like hiring is often a landscape into that company's strategy of where they're planning to make investments in these times. And so there's sometimes are ways to kind of back into potential areas of opportunity just merely by being able to see where they've chosen to make investments in terms of where their hiring goes to.
Absolutely. And one of my favorite tips to give folks is if you're looking for different opportunities, right? Like put like a kind of like a note on your calendar once a week, once a month to go and just look up different press releases that these consulting firms are putting out. Where you see a new partner hire, you can expect more hires to follow in that practice area, right? So for example, Alvarez and Marsal earlier this year, right, poached 2 partners from other big 4 firms, right? So whatever practice areas those partners were joining, you can expect that they're going to be building out their teams in the near future, right? And so that's where hiring is more than likely going to happen. And so, and you have to read between the lines a little bit, but you can figure that out just by following the press releases. And so you don't need any kind of like insider information. You just need to put a little bit of thought behind how you're going to figure things out.
That's great advice. All right, we're hitting the home stretch here, folks. So if you have any questions or any comments, feel free to throw them in the chat. We're going to wrap up soon, but feel free to throw any last minute stuff that you have in there because we'd love to be able to answer it. But I guess, Naaman, last question for you before we kind of move on to the next thing and really close this out. Let's do advice. So let's start with first years. What advice do you have for them? Knowing it's September right now. What should they be focused on, or what's the thing that if they do, that will help them move forward, kind of in their journey with management consulting recruiting?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not too early to begin networking, right? Unless your program has specifically told you, please don't reach out yet, right? So don't ruin the program's relationship with the firm because of something that I said, but right, begin networking as soon as possible, right? So the first thing you do before you network is you make sure your resume is as strong as possible. So it's not too early to begin tweaking that, making sure that your story is clear, compelling, concise, right? Because that's going to be something that folks you network with ask for. So begin the networking process now. And then again, right, begin to case out loud, right? You don't have to be doing 20 cases a week, but start to just kind of get a familiarity for how a case is put together, get a familiarity for component pieces of a case, right? What it feels like when a case flows. Right? We've got a lot of walkthrough videos on our platform that can kind of help you visualize that. and just begin to kind of get in the groove of, okay, here's what a case is, right? And I have a non-business or non-quant background. So what do I need to focus on, right? I really need to dive in and start really strengthening my mental math, or, right, there are some kind of business acumen things, right, that I'm just struggling with because of my background. No big deal, but let me start reading the Wall Street Journal every day. Let me like pick up a subscription to The Economist and just start, right, intentionally preparing myself for these interviews that are coming. So that's my kind of big advice for first years, on top of, hey, I know you're busy, right? This is a new environment. You're doing a ton of Zoom classes, right? Keep that GPA up. But like outside of what you're doing in the classroom, really just begin to network and begin that case prep journey.
Okay, that's great. How about for second years? What advice do you have for them? Like, what's the one thing they can do right now to help move them forward towards their goal?
Yeah, so this is going to be kind of a dual answer, right? If you already have an interview, out loud practice, right? That's the only thing in between now and when you're going to be interviewing that's really going to move the needle for your performance. So, right, that advice is the same, right? Figure out where you're not strong, do drill-based practice, do it out loud, and then reconstruct the case, right? And really pressure test yourself before you walk into the interviews, right? That's for folks who have an interview. For folks who don't, right, the advice really mirrors kind of what I told the first years, except just on an accelerated timeline, right? At this point, right, you have to network starting Monday, right, to figure out where firms still have staffing needs, right? Which offices, which practice areas, right? Which firms, like, where can you still get your foot in the door now because they haven't hit their quota yet, right? So that needs to be happening now. Those conversations, you need to be having those now, right? And then concurrently, unfortunately, just because of the way that the timelines fall, you have to really kick your case prep into high gear, because if you wait until you are certain you have an interview, it's going to be too late, right? And so then that case prep kind of guidance for you really mirrors what I've been saying all along, is that when you've got 2 to 4 weeks to prepare, right, the time for reading books is over, the time for watching a lot of videos is over. You just really need to throw yourself into the fire and start running through kind of, case iterations out loud. I sound like a broken record, but that's really what's going to help, right? Over the last 12 years of helping 10,000 plus candidates, that's what we found. And so that's what you need to be doing.
Okay, last question, and we'll make it short, but I think we should answer it because I know it gets asked all the time. Akshay wants to know, can you let us know how to find out which of the top 20 US consulting firms sponsor? Does this policy change year on year, or is it dependent on target schools, or is it dependent on MBA or STEM degree or not?
Yeah. So kind of like the official line for top 20 and just consulting firms in general is we don't sponsor, right? That's like the official line. There are exceptions to the rule. How do you figure out if you're an exception? You network, right? And typically, right, firms will make that exception if, number one, you have some kind of skill, usually a technical skill that they cannot find in someone with US work authorization already, right? So you have some kind of like really advanced skill that just sets you apart. They're willing to sponsor in that case, right? And of course, right, those are digital practices that are looking for that, or firms like Accenture. Number two, if for whatever reason they just cannot find enough warm bodies for folks that are, out of the pool that already has US work authorization, this cycle, that's not really going to be the case. So if you cannot, distinguish yourself in some way, right, by some kind of skill or experience, it's going to be really tough for you. And right, that's just a combination of right, what's most cost effective and efficient for the firm, as well as just kind of the uncertainty in the political environment right now. No one's really sure what the rules and regulations are, and if they start the process, if it's going to be finished, right? All of those kinds of things. And so my advice to you is, if you want to be a consultant in the US and you don't have US work authorization, network inside of US offices, figure out, right, if they will make an exception for you, or what the process looks like to be considered. But at the same time, be networking inside of offices, inside of countries where you do have work authorization. Get an offer anywhere, right? And then put in for a transfer 1 to 2 years down the line, right? People don't always like to hear that, but if that is your kind of end goal, right? If you're a top performer in the Brussels office and you put in for a transfer to New York a year or two down the line, right? The firm's going to want to keep you happy and they're going to want to keep you around. Your chances are exponentially higher of getting a transfer at that time and being sponsored at that time. And in that 1 to 2 years, you can also start to kind of network internally with folks inside of US based offices, and get over that way. So high level, that would be my advice for you.
Great. Great. Well, that was the last question we had. Naaman, thank you for joining us. If people want to find you, where should they go?
Yep, they should go to managementconsulted.com. My colleague Jay, if it's on the call, I'll have him pop that URL in the chat bar. And they can email us, right? team@managementconsulted.com, right? Our team monitors that email almost 24/7. We aim to get back to you within 1 to 2 business days. So if you just have follow-up questions, if you need some kind of more situation-specific advice, if you want to work with us, just shoot us an email and we'll try and help as much as we can.
Great. For those of you out there, if you want to learn more from MBA Schooled, check out our blog. I'll pop it again in the chat, but we have a whole corner focused on management consulting and all about students who have gone through the experience and have lived what you are living. I also have a podcast. Check it out at mbaschool.com/podcast. And then last but not least, if you want some guidance on how to navigate business school, check out my book, MBA Insider, which you can find on Amazon. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a great rest of your Saturday afternoon and best of luck in your management consulting recruiting journey.
Thanks everyone.